Welcome to another episode on catalyzing radical systemic change, where it's all about discovering, mapping, and cross-pollinating what I think are the necessary building blocks towards a planetary civilization ahead. Today, we are touching upon a rather broad topic, which is real estate, and what can possibly this inflection point we're facing as humanity towards a regenerative economy have to do with real estate. I actually think it can and necessarily needs to have a lot in common, because if we look at the total assets under management worldwide, a huge chunk of that is parked in real estate. And today my guest from Chicago is Juan Saldana. He's working since 24 years in the sector and is actually developing real estate in Chicago, but also in other parts of the US and also in other countries. So as always, in the very beginning, I'm really curious if you could sketch one or two, maybe three turning points in your biography when you became ultimately aware of the power that you have as a real estate developer. So the floor is yours, Juan.
Alistair, good morning. Thank you for having me on your podcast. It's always an honor to spend time with you. You're such an intentional human being, and I really appreciate this opportunity. So, I would say that there's three major inflection points. One of them was when I was a child. My parents were immigrants, came to this country and settled in Chicago, and they bought a piece of real estate. I was 10 years old at the time. And I quickly realized that sort of transformed and changed our family. We were able to sell the property at a future date. And that allowed us to really look at, just look at how families can grow and evolve in America. I don't know how it is in other parts of the world. I quickly became very interested in how that really changed our family's economics. And so that sort of stuck with me. So that's point one. The second time was when I was in college and I studied finance. I took a real estate modeling class, and I was like, wow, this is very exact. They were really interesting in seeing how real estate has a lot of great features, like the exactitude, right? Meaning like there's a lot of unknowns, but there's so many things that are known. And so as compared to the stock market, there's just so many variables. It seemed like there was fewer variables in real estate. So then finally in my career, I was working for the government, and a lot of larger developers were getting incentives to do projects. Those incentives were tied to things such as job creation, changing landscapes, infrastructures, and such. And I became very interested that only the largest developers were getting the largest amounts of funding from the city. When I looked to see if there was people of color getting funding, there was very, very few, maybe one or two amongst hundreds. And I started doing the research a little deeper, and I realized that this is just as an entire country. It is very interesting to see that not a lot of larger developers or even community developers get funding from municipalities. And at that moment in time, I started thinking about this whole idea of a public-private relationship with real estate. And so I started to really start looking more deeply at municipalities and how they need to grow and evolve. Looked at the financial fiscal impacts of different municipalities and why it's important for them to continue having people stay in their community. And that became fascinating. It was a fascinating thing. And I realized that there's a lot of different markets, for real estate and different types of asset classes. But there's also, if you really look deeply, a lot of these larger projects have a lot of subsidy. And I wanted to make sure that those subsidies were going to be equitable, that those subsidies were going to actually really influence growth in those communities. And when I started looking more closely, I realized that there was a lot of, mismatch. So I became super interested in the subject and decided to start a company that was highly conscious, right? We started looking at what is equity, what is community wealth, what is financial resiliency when it comes to community, and that's where it all began. So all of those things were very deeply influential, and it got me to where I am today.
So then the next question would be, obviously, since you're deploying the capital, you also need to follow the rules and the regulations of the market. But there's one part in following the system, and there's another part in actually also shaping the sector. So I'm curious to listen in where you need to follow, and also where you see possibilities where you're shaping already, and even more where you sense is a good opportunity for you to shape the market.
That's wonderful. Thank you. So a lot of the funding that comes from it, there's several types, right? So we look at investor capital, we look at debt financing, we look at public financing, and then there's another layer that what I call philanthropic financing to help catalyze community reinvestment. And so when we start looking at all of these things put together, for the public side, it's highly public, and therefore you have to meet certain objectives. One of those objectives is your community development agreement. In our city, and many cities have different words for it, but really it's an agreement with the public sector and the private sector saying that you are going to try to achieve the metrics or the measurements of impact that you're trying to put together for that particular community or that particular area. So there's a lot of things that need to be done. There's a lot of legal documentation that needs to happen. So that's very constricted. When you look at capital, financial capital, if you have an investment thesis, you have to be very, very accurate. You can't say, "Oh, I'm going to build mixed use," and then you start building industrial. It doesn't really equate or work. So you have to sort of stay in those lanes, so to speak. But what's extremely unique in this particular new phase of catalyzing community reinvestment is that the community and can take an active role in innovative projects that are going to create resiliency, right? And there's new, like everything that is that people thought was like, well, is that something that's an asset, right? Is a community investment trust important for the community? What's happening now is that the norms of capitalism are being challenged in hyper-local communities. Let me repeat that. The norms of capitalism are being challenged in hyper-local communities. What does that mean? That means that communities are now taking an active role in some level of ownership, participation, stewardship, things of that nature. So where the innovation is coming from really is the microcosm, right? What we call impact, right, is happening in the communities. And then at the macrocosm level, we're looking at these large funds. I don't know if your audience knows about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. What's happening is large corporations, large organizations are really focusing their financial portfolio into actually changing the dynamics of culture, climate, equity, things of that. There's 19 development goals and such. And a lot of these development goals are now translating into community-based, what I call S of the ESG model, developments and investment opportunities. So where I think the market is going is that the largest developers are really now looking more deeply into this. We're looking at really creating and changing social outcomes, governance outcomes, and environmental outcomes. And the way to do that really is to take an active role into the growth of your own community, because what we've realized over even the pandemic is that resiliency is a must for any community. Does not matter if you're in the United States or in Europe. We have to make sure that there's, food, transportation, access. These things are going to be always important. And why not in this kind of, world where equity is important now, becoming, I wouldn't say fashionable, but I would say that it's now at the forefront of people's psyche. Let's start thinking a little bit more deeply of how do we do this in a very intentional way with consciousness to really look at all of the other aspects of development that create that ecosystem. And I say ecosystem because we're very interdependent. Even though it might be a hyper-local community, we're dependent on the city, the state, and the other types levels of government to actually trickle down, but from this point sprout up from the community to make change happen in a way that it's equitable and also fair.
Out of the development projects that you have already undertaken and those on the way, could you sketch a couple of examples to exemplify on a hyperlocal level how that looks like, how you're doing development differently, also some of the seedlings that you see where out of you deploying capital and structuring the projects in a different way, actually the people living there having a better life?
Absolutely. So there's a couple of models. One of them is we worked in a smaller community in Chicago. Well, it's actually not a smaller community. It's a very vibrant community in the southwest side of Chicago called La Villita or Little Village. It has a culture of entrepreneurship. It has around 1,200 businesses. And after the recession of 2008, the Amazon effect and everything, a lot of the stores are starting to sort of dwindle down. And this community is very resilient because of that culture. So we helped build an incubator space called the Esquina Incubator. And what this project really is a catalyst for community reinvestment, because what happens is that the culture of entrepreneurship stays in the community. The building itself was a public-private partnership, an impact investment in real estate. So we got philanthropy to step in and invest in a building in the middle of the commercial corridor to actually be a demonstration project for the rest of the corridor. And so what we have now is a development that's around 13,000 square feet, shared commercial kitchen, incubator space for small businesses, community cafe. And really the idea is to draw energy into the space and have people interact and come up with ideas. We know that we cannot solve all the problems. All we know is that we can set the stage, set the intention, put a project, it's going to be a very profitable project for the organizations that are involved. And what ends up happening is that over time, that particular asset, because it's earning revenues, can be owned by the community itself. So not only is it a catalyst for growth, it is also an economic catalyst for the community. So those two things together create a very strong punch. Another project we have working is on the southeast side of Chicago. My business partner, who's African-American, worked over 3 years interviewing all of his neighbors and wanted to really create a new future. He said, well, what's going to be important for our community? Bronzeville has a tremendous history. If you look up Bronzeville, Chicago is one of those neighborhoods that has a tremendous amount of history. Sam Cooke, Quincy Jones, a lot of amazing people, artists, etc., leaders, thought leaders came from that area. But because of the policies of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the neighborhood was just basically devastated without any investment. And all of the investment happened in the north side of Chicago. Well, we come back, P3 Markets comes to the table and says, let's do something extraordinary. And so what we did was we thought super big. Let's create $100 million project over a few phases. Let's find ourselves a large developer. Let's create a joint venture with them. And let's go ahead and build something just as good or better than in other parts of the city. And let's offer all of those amenities and services, cultural spaces and connectivity to that community. And so a tremendous success. The city of Chicago is extremely happy about where we are at. We're actually topping off the first phase, which is a 10-story building. The reason it's so important is because it got us in the driver's seat of working with a large merchant builder institution. We were able to connect and build this amazing asset, and all of the ground floor retail will be taken up by people of color, which means that we were able to subsidize a lot of that space. We worked out a deal with the developer to say, hey, we as an organization want to purchase the commercial real estate assets, the ground floor retail. So then at some point in the future, we can then sell it potentially to the end user, right? Because what ends up happening in big neighborhoods, when there's a great neighborhood that's evolving and changing, a lot of these, they call it gentrification, or, basically, getting people out of their community. Well, the reason that is because people don't own the real estate. They don't own the commercial real estate. So we were like, Well, before that happens, let's put a program in place to be able to, at the point when we stabilize the asset, have those real deep conversations about, hey, maybe it's time for you to think about ownership versus rent. So it's most people like building big balance sheets and et cetera. We see ourselves more as building ecosystems that are going to evolve, grow, and create resiliency. So as if we do that more often, then we start to entice larger investments, larger different investors into projects, and then we're able to do them at scale. So that's basically, two examples. There's many more, but those are the ones that are in my hometown.
What I find striking, because the segue towards building a whole ecosystem for sustainable or conscious real estate is very interesting, because at least in my mind and heart, these two examples in the neighborhood are not only following the market, they're really rethinking the very model how real estate is done, and also how to prevent the gentrification aspects of it. I mean, how beautiful that at least you have the possibility then to offer to these disenfranchised communities to move from rent to ownership. Let's ping pong in between the different layers of this ecosystem. So the sketched examples are obviously hyper local, so they're really in a specific part of Chicago. What are the other components that you think need to move and where you are involved in to have a bigger impact, let's say on a municipality level, state level, and national level? I don't know if the international level plays like any role for you as a developer on the ground.
Yeah, I think there's first it's that a lot of the intelligence that's being created, what I call it again in the micro level, the microcosm, is not being shared, and those learnings are not necessarily being shared with others. There's a reason for that, because first of all, they're heavily concentrated where they are. So I think there's an opportunity to really share all those learnings across our country, and even internationally. There's a lot of different markets, right? Again, different types of asset classes. But when we think about the ecosystem, what we're really thinking about are things that seem obvious but are not very obvious. For example, allowing the community to participate and own, part of the project. I mean, it doesn't seem like it's radical, but it is, because if a developer is doing a project, they're like, well, why would the community own any of this? We're the ones coming up with all the money. We're taking all the risk. We have this large back office we've got to take care of. But what I've realized is that it is possible. It is possible, because what we have to do is look at other ways of funding projects. And if the municipalities or the state or other funding sources are available, then why not have those conversations, right? It could also happen in reverse. There's nothing that says that a very well organized organization or community can come to the table and basically say, hey, we'd like to be part of this project and own or steward, right, a piece of this project, and basically then start to take action in their own hands. As a matter of fact, that is already happening in other parts of the country. An organization called the American Sustainable Business Network, ASBN, has been cataloging a lot of these different projects. And one of the concepts is, let's create a book of knowledge. Let's share it with all the practitioners. Let's also share it with investors that might be looking to do projects that are fun, engaging, resilient, sort of ESG labeled, right? And we're solving two problems. We're solving the problem that's happening in communities, but we're also solving the big money problem. Where do I put my money? If you hear a lot of these larger conversations around finance, it's, we just can't find good projects. I think that's just basically some type of an excuse. There's a lot of ways to deploy capital. I think that we have to professionalize the processes, be very intentional about continuously improving the models, be very clear about what are the objectives and metrics, be very clear about what does impact really look like. and people think it's just about money, but it's not. It's also about creating long-term, long tail benefits for communities, what we call cascading benefits. For example, why is nature detracted from a development? Why is placemaking detracted from it? What are those actual values? If we look at like these large crises like mental health, well, if you actually look very closely at what's happening, is because they have a job that's 2 miles away from where they live. There isn't any trees near where they live. The access to transportation is very difficult. There's really not that many jobs. They're barely making ends meet. And so of course there's going to be a mental health crisis because they feel that they can't live with dignity. They can't live with the dignity of their lives. They can't actually do what they feel is important. And I'm not speaking for them as a victim. I think a lot of people don't feel that way, but they also see the stark reality that is the lack of access, the lack of investment, and they feel powerless. So if the funding is there, and philanthropy has done a great job at like, let's solve these problems. They're sort of like, the seed capital to get some of these things sort of going. But we have to really entice, and we have to also inspire, big money to say, you know what? It makes more sense for us to invest in financial resiliency in a community, go deep, and then have that community sort of grow and educate and extract and share from each other, and then grow organically. It becomes more cohesive, and there's a lot of more communal things that can happen. So I think that the real challenge here is getting all of these wonderful projects in front of larger level investors as a macrocosm, and try to influence policy and investment objectives to actually really looking deeper into the cascading benefits of those investments. And that's definitely possible.
So, I mean, with that, you have basically taken a couple of bullet points off my list to ask you. What I find particularly interesting, and I completely agree, is that philanthropy can only be the very start of it. What we need to rethink are the cascading benefits and bake them into the business models, like you say, long-term and long tail, as well as these cascading benefits. When I think about, let's stay with this hyperlocal example. So I don't mind which one of the two, or you sketch a third one. How do you think realistically this is going forward? Maybe it's easier to stay with Chicago for a moment. So when you have a good example, how do you enter the next playing field and unlock further funds to move into a corridor that is more likely to build community resiliency?
That's a great question. So what we need to do is a couple of things, right? We have to look at the numbers, right? At the end of the day, although a lot of these ideas or concepts are out there, we have to make sure that they pencil out. That they at the end of the day, whether it's a longer term outlook for financial returns or actual returns, everyone gets stuck in the short term, 3 years, 5 years, et cetera, right? And that's going to be important for the project to maintain and stabilize. So if it does not pass the stabilization period, then you have a project that basically is going to be hard to move forward. So at the end of the day, at some level, there has to be a measurement of success. So I look at it like a 3-year stabilization period. At that moment in time, you look at all of the learnings, right? So we're sort of in the middle of the process. I don't want to say that we figured it out. I think when we figure it out is when we realize that someone takes the same template and says, hey, how did that happen? What would you do different? Where can you shorten your timeframes? What could you do now that, what would you have done that you would have done before, et cetera? And, they say community development is messy, and it really is. It's very messy, but it's very necessary. So as messy as it is, And what I've realized is that, could you imagine going to a investor meeting saying, well, you got to wait 3 years to actually figure out if this actually worked. It's not going to work. Mostly what you'll get is a lot of, it's all theoretical. But once it's no longer theoretical, once you realize that after those 3 years, you actually have the data that demonstrates that this project was extremely successful at all E, S, and G levels, then they'll ignore you until they realize, wow, this is a gem. This is a diamond that was created through a lot of pressure and work. And I think that that's what needs to happen across the board. Everyone's looking for the quick fix. Let's get it done now. You know what I mean, et cetera, et cetera. And they want quick financial results. That's not the way the world is going to work in the future. I think we're going to have to start looking at longer term sort of returns, because if we're always chasing profits, we're not chasing life. We're excluding life from the equation. And we're not just another peg. We're not just another line in a pro forma. People are not that way, but they're being felt that way. You know what I mean? If you look at even if you look at all the other types of systems that are interconnected with real estate, they're very much like that. And so someone has to take a stand and say, you know what, let's look at the long-term cascading benefits of doing this investment. Maybe we're not making as much money in the beginning. It pencils out, we meet our objectives. However, the project has tremendous benefits for communities, and it has tremendous benefits long-term, because all of a sudden that becomes a templatized type of project that can then be taken somewhere else. And then if you start looking at, well, how does this affect economics overall? Well, there's less money being spent by municipalities to cover some of these issues. There's higher productivity from people that are actually living in these communities. Local and other retailers are getting high quality workforce. Well, isn't that novel? I'm not spending, 50 cents out of every dollar to retrain somebody, because my employees are happy, they're good. And so we have to stop thinking that the way things are going is going to be the way things are going to go in the future, especially when we throw in climate change. Like, let's throw that wrench into the whole situation. Let's throw all these other challenges that are happening. We have to really start looking at how do we solve all of these things, not apart from each other, as an ecosystem. That's why I keep saying, how is the real estate ecosystem connected to the larger ecosystems? And how is that interconnectivity really supposed to interact? And it interacts a lot with finance, with investments from municipalities, from all of those different sources of capital that are available to make those things change and actuate.
As we all have limited bandwidth, and as we know, attention follows intention, where do you consciously put your life force besides the, let's say, real estate development on the ground to influence the other layers? You were mentioning here and there the advocacy piece, templatizing the endeavors. So when you take an own second horizon perspective on yourself and your endeavors, let's say maybe 3 to 5 years, where do you see the acupuncture points you need to make to really get this, I would not say off the ground, but again, like reach a different playing field?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's in collaboration. It's really looking at other types of things that matter. So, for example, I think that nature-based assets, for lack of better words, assets, the word I'm going to use, are extremely important. We're already seeing a lot of changes happening with, at a global scale with supply chain because of what happened with the pandemic. Things are happening at a global scale because of climate. Just now, Britain, we recorded the highest temperature ever. And I'm just like looking at the data and thinking, we really need to work harder and smarter now, not in 5 years, not 10. It's today. It's actually maybe 3 years ago. And so looking at all of these different opportunities for the market to get involved in requires a I call multi-dimensional conversation. So we need to really be talking to leadership. We need to be talking to sovereign funds. We need to be talking to all of these different organizations that care about changing the planet, or at the very least, not wanting to maintain the status quo. You know what I mean? To be able to really make that change happen. So very specifically, my acupuncture points would be continuing to advance the study or the investments in things that make people mobile and make them live with fewer pressures, right? So for example, if housing is not affordable, then we're going to have more people becoming homeless and becoming poor, right? Because they can't afford to live where they live. If we don't invest in green infrastructure as much as gray infrastructure, we're going to have a lot of gray infrastructure that's creating a hotter climate, and we're not lowering that climate. And so what I see that needs to be solved is really the communication we're emerging into a new system, and we need to create emergent economics and emergent processes to be able to handle the emergent future, the very highly interconnected future. And so for some reason, I don't know if that message is lost. We need to really rethink the way that we invest and that we put together all of our activities, all of our energies into an emergent world that's changing extremely rapidly. So to be able to take like a microcosm model, share with the macrocosm and say, whoa, we're talking about how this could be needled, maybe all over this country, maybe take some of the best practices from here and transfer them to another place, right? And then get real about, what is the municipality doing? What is the state doing? How are those organizations working together to solve these problems? Because it seems like, especially with leadership, it's like, well, I got 4 years, so I got to do what I can to stay alive. My last year, I have to run for office. And so I'm less interested in a lot of these other things because I have a vested interest or to move forward in this way. And so there's a lot of different interests that are always having control of the conversation. We need to become resilient. That word resiliency is super important. And it's actually good medicine for every country. I'm not saying separateness, I'm saying interconnectedness and emergent, but resilient, right? Resilient meaning that you can take hold and take advantage of the things that are available to you in front of you, right? And make the best of it, make it as optimize what you have versus look for something that's not there. You know what I mean? And so I think that that particular wisdom of taking what is there and optimizing it and really sharing it, stewarding it, protecting it, looking at nature as also medicine and taking care of that is going to bring a tremendous amount of not only benefits for your financial aspects of your life, but also your mental health and your spiritual health, really. So I think that that's super important, that we look at nature not as something that needs to solve, but the solution itself. You know what I mean? And looking at those natural systems, those ecosystems. That's why I use those words to actually inform that we're not separate, that we are all interconnected, and we all have to sort of work together, in this flow.
What gives you hope? So when we look into the crystal ball of our collective future, nobody can really make predictions. We're certainly at a inflection point. Some call it the multi-crisis. I call it the great transition. I think we're already in the middle of it. A lot of the old and the new world are colliding. When you take a positive outlook and you see your own responsibility on a global level, again, staying with the contribution the sector of real estate can make, and you maybe take a longer stretch of time, let's make it a decade until we meet again. Where do you think, especially real estate, thinking large scale or ultra large scale, can really make a difference?
That's a great question. Thank you, Alistair. Well, real estate if we think about it as something to own, it's always going to have a short-term or shorter-term sort of time frame, right? It's really about creating profits. I think of real estate sometimes as building, right? Like if you look at it very at the most basic level, right? It's building something, creating something. And if you're creating it in urban environments, if you're creating it in non-urban environments, it's still a creation, you know? And so what I feel is in 10 years, if we continue to think about real estate as silos, I think that's going to be a tragedy, right? Real estate development as just being a siloed event, right? If big money thinks about real estate as being siloed, that's going to be a problem. You know what I mean? What we need to do is work with, again, with creation, right? With this idea of creation, and think bigger than that single thing that's happening, and then get the developers of the future to think about things like, well, not only am I building for resiliency, I'm also building for climate. I'm also building for this. I'm also building for that. So when we think about the word build, you're not building a building. You're building an ecosystem that affects so many other things. So in 10 years, what I would like to say is that if we're able to take a different approach to real estate as build and steward versus build and own, I think that'll tremendously change. There's a bias, right? That's out there. It's called a zero-sum bias, a winner and a loser, right? It's just something that is ingrained for whatever reason. You know, I don't want to go into the historical reasons why that is, but it happens across politics, business, etc. But we're entering into a world where we have no option but to be non-zero sum. That means that we have to have a high level of participation, a high level of belonging, a high level of interactivity, a high level of emergence. There is no doubt. If you look at what's happening in what we call quote unquote the metaverse, that's why people are jumping on it, because people get to interact, they get to build, they get to do all these amazing things together, and they feel connected to that. But it's a digital world, right? What's happening to the real world is that we're not allowing that to happen, right? The game of reality is changing fundamentally. So I'm not saying the metaverse is not important and that, you know, we shouldn't allow that to occur in its natural order. What I'm saying is that we have this beautiful planet that has amazing, tremendous resources, and we have the ability, the models, the intelligence, the money, the people to actually really think of it more interconnectedly and invest in that future is what's important. So what we need to do is inspire a whole band of new developers that want to create the real world in a way that they feel is important to them. So I'm very big on that. I would like to see more people of color, women, you know, non-binary, whatever, you know, really want to take advantage of, this is my community. I'd like to build something extraordinary. I want it to be backed by nature, in community with nature, in relationship with nature, and then build it. Because only then are we going to get out of this whole situation. Because if we keep building these massive skyscrapers that have beautiful windows, it's great, but it's all kind of the same, right? It's time to really change it. Look at integrating nature into the built environment, integrating social and governance into the built environment. It's about really inspiring the ground, you know, and the sky to work together, you know, ground, the microcosm, macrocosm to work together. And it's not happening. It's happening in little spaces. But if you ask me, how do I elevate? I like to have this conversation with larger organizations, big developers that have multi-billion-dollar assets to be like, you know what? Let's take a step back and look at a long-term, long-tail development. Let's create legacy, beautiful assets with nature, intertwined with the community, having stewardship and governance and activity and a sense of ownership and real ownership into it. We'll see a whole different world emerge. I guarantee you that.
So last bullet point for today. You wrote yourself, your peers often describe you as a creator, magician, and rebel. I sense that the people already got an idea on that, but maybe as your closing words, what makes you, Juan Saldana, as a real estate developer, a creator, magician, and rebel?
Great, that's pretty funny. So when we were thinking about archetypes, right, of a person, a creator is somebody who likes to bring things together, right? Creation doesn't happen in a vacuum. Creation happens when a lot of other things come together and make it happen. So the reason I was described as a creator, I guess, is that I like to bring new things to the table, right? Hey, let's try something that has never been tried before. And, sometimes people look and think that that's a little wild, right? Like, why would we do something different? You know what I mean? Everything's working because, it's just not like that. I would say magician because as difficult as it may look, as there's problems that require solutions, there's solutions that require problems. I think that being magical in the sense is that you sometimes create magic from interactions, from time and space, right? It just all of a sudden a solution happens from higher consciousness that no one thought about, and all of a sudden, voila, the magic has occurred, right? And then rebel, it's important to really challenge the norms. If you don't challenge the norms, it's gonna stay the same. And I'm a rebel in that sense because I'm always, kind of pushing a little bit more. Well, what about that? Did you think about that? And I get those same questions, right? And so I'm just like, sure, let's be rebels together. So I like to create a little bit of trouble. I'm not gonna lie. I think it's important to be a little bit of a troublemaker because if not, things will never change and they'll never shift into a better way. So all of them are important. The rebel is like the coyote at medicine. The magician is kind of like the artisan, and the creator is kind of like, and sort of like the connector, etc., is kind of like the king or queen, right? So like all those archetypes are somewhere in me, and so I kind of feel like that's important to share. So thank you for that. I think it was kind of a funny question, but I think I hope it made sense the way I explained it.
Thanks, Juan, for the conversation.